This is Dr. Jerome Corsi, and today it's Wednesday. Thank you for joining us here on thetruthcentral.com. You can find me on X at Corsi Jerome 1, number 1, CORSIJEROME 1, all lowercase, all together. And on Substack, you can get me at jeromecorsiphd.substack.com. Now, today I want to do a deep dive into a fundamental question, which is the rot that has gotten to be the center of the Democratic Party, and how the Democratic Party is gone in a Marxist direction. It is now a Marxist party, or neo-Marxist party, meaning not specifically as Marx believed that we would have a workers of the world revolt, but rather more in terms of the Frankfurt School, that we would have a cultural revolution that would destroy family, destroy God, and destroy capitalism. Now, to start with the energy issue, and there's 2 books I've written that develop these points, and I hope people are getting a chance to read them. Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change, and it is about the exposing climate lies in an age of disinformation. Now, I'm arguing in this book that, of course, climate science as it's being presented, global warming, is all nonsense. Carbon dioxide is a very, very minimal amount of the Earth's atmosphere, 0.04%. It is not a major greenhouse gas. 70% of all greenhouse gases are water vapor. But the reason the left demonizes carbon dioxide is because hydrocarbon fuels emit carbon dioxide. And so therefore, the idea of it being a greenhouse gas and warming up the world, so we have these catastrophic crises of all the hurricanes, all these, they call it climate porn, all the extreme events of tornadoes and typhoons and volcanoes and all the other climate disasters that they can figure out to blame on climate change, global warming, carbon dioxide, are nonsense. Now, I'm pointing out several things in this book. One of the main ones I want to focus on today, very quickly, is the work was done by Edward Lorenz, who was a mathematician and meteorologist, and he was a professor in the Department of Meteorology at MIT in the 1960s. Now, he had a lab experiment. He had a computer, early digital computer. It was a Royal McBee LGP30, which today would be considered to be a primitive computer. He ran a computer model he constructed to predict the weather. It used 12 independent variables to measure aspects of the weather, including temperature and wind speed. And then one day in February 1961, Lorenz repeated a simulation that he'd run earlier, but this time he rounded off one variable from 0.56127 to 0.506. And when he went to get a cup of coffee, he returned to his office and he was shocked to find this tiny alteration had dramatically transformed the whole pattern the program was producing over 2 months of simulated weather. And he published an article saying that these small changes in measurement produce a tremendous difference in outcome. He decided this was a chaos theory, because what he came to realize was that these mathematical principles involved in these small changes in numbers were also related to the whole idea of this nonlinear differential equations, which had been used for the dynamic of water cascades, which are predictable, but when you run the equations, they change in a non-predictable way. So these equations are very difficult to solve. So Lorenz, in his book, The Essence of Chaos, Lorenz discovered why differential equations are the appropriate mathematical tool for handling flows, including water oscillation or the action of a pinball machine. And he found that these kinds of mathematics applied to weather, which also had patterns, but they weren't predictable. So what he's most famous for is he presented a paper in which he said essentially the predictability. Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil, the minor change, set up a tornado in Texas? And he was questioning whether the single flap of a butterfly's wing could generate a tornado somewhere else in the world. He was using the idea that a butterfly's wing was a occurrence of an incident, which then produced a cascade of effects that would not have happened had the butterfly's wings not fluttered at that particular moment in that particular way. Okay, now chaos theory is fundamental to understanding. You can see that's the mathematics of a fractal model that is shows it looks like a butterfly. It produces these nodes around patterns, and they become recognizable. And that the particular one he studied turned out to be looking like a butterfly, and that's where he came up with the fly effect. These were strange attractors, they're called in fractal math. In other words, that there's a pattern around a point, and it has a particular structure to how the data takes place as you run equations over and over and over again, with the result of one equation seeding the next equation for its variables. It's complicated mathematically. Now, what this points out is that there is no effective way to predict weather. There's no effective way to run these mathematical models that can say if we have a little bit more hydrocarbon fuels, we're going to have so much carbon dioxide that we're going to have the climate burn up because we're exceeding 1.5 degrees above the industrial era. When the Industrial Revolution began, we needed to go back to before there was an Industrial Revolution to get normal temperature. Well, there is no normal temperature on Earth. There is no right temperature on Earth. Earth's temperature is just what it is. Human beings are only here recently. The last few million years. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. And the Earth has gone through massive changes in that time. 5 massive extinctions of just about everything alive on Earth before human beings ever got here. The idea that we are going to affect weather is laughable when you consider that the forces in weather are far, far beyond our control. Now, the theme today that I want to develop is when the Democrats get off on this idea and they begin going down this rabbit hole, the results we're facing is that, for instance, here's a story that was just published in the Daily Telegraph, and it was essentially saying that the Europe is facing an industrial wipeout. That, in other words, because Europe has gone to abandon in Germany nuclear power, because they're going to wind and solar, which are not effective forms of energy. The wind doesn't blow all the time. The sun doesn't shine all the time. And these are inefficient technologies, inefficient sources of energy, that Europe is now facing too high a cost to manufacture. And so it's deindustrializing. Cost of energy is just too high in Europe right now, especially with the Russian cutoff of natural gas in retaliation for the sanctions the EU placed on Russia invading Ukraine 2 years ago. And now China's entering the market with cheap foreign electric vehicles. It will undercut, just like China owns the solar panel market because of cheap solar panels. The companies that were seeking to have huge gains in the United States from these various acts that Obama has passed and Biden has passed to fund green energy turn out to be boondoggles. The companies go broke once the government subsidies run dry. And you're seeing with a deindustrialized Europe the consequences of this left thinking, which is based on a misinterpretation of science, an ideology, almost a religious belief, a climate cult based on having to get rid of hydrocarbon fuels, which are not fossil fuels. They're purely natural. They're made in the mantle of the earth on an ongoing basis, is a sort of insanity. And the insanity was architected intentionally to produce an economic decline, knowing that without hydrocarbon fuels, fewer people would be able to eat without nitrogen fertilizers. We couldn't grow the food to produce enough food for 6 or 8 billion people on the planet. And the idea is to depopulate. Actually, from Henry Kissinger, 1974, who wrote National Security Memorandum 200 for Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger made depopulation the official U.S. government policy, and it's never been rescinded. Now, these are frightening thoughts. And what I'm saying is that they produce a sort of insanity, a sort of mass psychosis in which people do irrational acts, which is stopping to use hydrocarbon fuels, which are abundant, natural, and relatively inexpensive, for wind and solar, which are ineffective, don't really work robustly, still need hydrocarbon backups, and are of a nature that they are going to reduce the standard of living for the middle class. And that's the intended goal. Okay, now I want to shift gears a little bit because I want to show you how all this stuff ties together. Let's go to woke now. And woke advances for the climate. My first book, The Climate, The Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change, says that the left lies and their science is junk science. Okay, now the next part I want to focus on is the sequel, The Truth About Neo-Marxism, Cultural Maoism, and Anarchy. And it's about exposing woke insanity in this age of disinformation. Now, I'm going to focus on this gender insecurity, which is a key part of the critical theory agenda from the Frankfurt School. And I want to focus on Judith Butler. Now, Judith Butler was a sociologist, I believe, and I'll find here in a second the exact references to her. That's Judith Butler. And if you think she might look a little bit masculine in that photograph, what I want to suggest to you, that's by intention. She is gender confused. In other words, her basic contribution to social science was to postulate that your sex is physical. It's your genitals and your internal organs, male, female. But that's your sex, but it's not your gender. And the gender is what's important. In other words, in gender, you can have, how do you determine gender? Well, Judith Butler said it was by the performance dynamics. In other words, it's what you do in sex that determines your gender, not your sexual organs. And your gender can then be confused. It could be all kinds of different things because it's not binary. It's not male, female. So suddenly you've got the liberty to make your gender whatever you think your gender ought to be, however you want to perform sexually. Now, this concept is, again, bizarre because you can say, well, look, and we combine it with the critical race theory, which is about discrimination and groups that are oppressed. And they have this intersectionality, which means that if you've got multiple forms of oppression, you gain more points. So therefore, let's just take it. And one example I always use is black. So that's 1 point because blacks are oppressed. Then you're a black woman. Well, that's 2 because women are oppressed. A black woman who's a transgender. And yes, women can be transgenders too. And you think your sexual performance was a black female transgender cat who lived a previous life in ancient Egypt. Now that's pretty high up on intersectionality for how many points you get for all of those different disabilities or discriminations. And what Judith Butler taught was that the confusion that occurs, especially as children are growing up and they are identifying sexually with not what they are biologically, that in fact you can engage in sex change operations, which essentially mutilate your body, maybe permanently, in a way that it fundamentally can cause you massive damage, massive psychological damage as you grow up, and massive physical damage because your body wasn't meant to be re-engineered from female to male or from male to female. And once you try to force that, you are complicating the body's basic biologic functions in a way that it produces disease, disorder, dysfunction. Okay, now the ultimate idea here, this lure, when you go to another level of this, is androgyny. In other words, what you want is the combination of male and female. And so therefore, at the highest level, the sexual confusion is both male and female, and the sexual behavior is a combination of any kind of confused behaviors or practices that you want to mix in. Such that Herbert Marcuse in the Frankfurt School in the 1960s wrote a book called Eros and Civilization, and what he was praising as the highest form of liberated sexuality was Marquis de Sade. Marquis de Sade was, if you've ever read any of his writings, they're absolutely bizarre. They are mostly sadomasochistic. And the sex is not particularly normal sex in any regard. Now, this queer theory that Butler developed, she was born in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1956, and became the Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and at the European Graduate School. She was at the European Graduate School. She had the Hannah Arendt Chair. She had a lot of distinguished positions. But her main theory of critical race theory was this argument that you are born in a world. I'll just read a part. Chapter 5 discussed hermaphrodites as the sexual term with occult implications, implying those born with both male and female organs. Evidently, in modern CGT theory, which is critical queer theory terminology, the highest state of Marcuse's polymorphic sexuality moves beyond transforming Eros into a hermaphrodite unisex. In a world where the list of imaginable gender identities may be unlimited, the post-genderism transformation of Eros involves all possible multivariate sexual identities evolved into a universal intersex of ambiguous genitalia. Now, if that's the highest stage of Butler's teachings, it's pretty messed up. And what you get is you get broken families, you get divorces, you get people not believing in God, you get a sexual dystopia in which we have to discern pronouns, and we can't confuse pronouns, or we are going to be committing microaggressions and are subject to punishment. These confused ideas end up producing dysfunction, and they were only intended to produce dysfunction. They were intended to make it so that society disintegrates. Now, this was pointed out by a Russian who fled Soviet Russia, Bezmenov, and fled to the United States. And Bezmenov laid out a simple roadmap. He said, this is, in fact, how communism will destroy America. And he laid out the entire methodology. Now, I'm going to, Chris will probably be able to find a Bezmenov clip. We might play a minute or two of it. But he said there were 4 stages. The first stage he called this demoralization. And he means that in the sense of demoralization, of getting rid of the morals. Demoralization means eliminating moral behavior. And so he said that basically people have to learn to disrespect God, that God doesn't exist, that they are without a nation, that we're no longer one nation, that we are the world, to educate a generation of students in a target country, which might take a series of years, but to be successful, the process of subversion at the stage of demoralization is always a two-way street. In other words, it means the target nation must be made a recipient of the ideas of the subverter. And the Marxist Leninism ideology is being pumped into at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged. So you can see the results in people who graduated in the 60s, the dropouts, half-baked intellectuals, who are now occupying positions of powers in government, civil service, business, mass media, and the education system. It's psychological warfare. And it's psychological warfare that centers on removing the moral behavior of a people that you want to engage in atheism and sex. So that's the first stage. And then from there, it goes into the destabilization, which is the second section, which is some event is created, like defunding the police. These ideas are so destructive that they create crime. People feel less secure. Society becomes less economically productive. So the destabilized situation, demoralized populations act irrationally. Okay, so they double down on their indoctrination. They become completely set ideologically, so they don't want to argue. They lock in rigidly into a totalitarianism. Stage 3, crisis. You create a crisis. COVID. We want to disrupt the election. Some election crisis, which will occur that will prevent us from voting in 2024. And Black Lives Matter, Antifa. So left-wing radicals, violent radicals begin operating in the open with the full support of the mass media. They take possession in community as law enforcement, prosecutors, city council members, members of boards of election, and they advance their progressive policy that further throws the society into chaos. So they bring in transgender story hours. They bring in the entire transgender, transgenders also transforms into unisex bathrooms. And it ultimately becomes violent and chaotic. Then the 4th stage, after you've created this crisis, people have given you more control to end the crisis. Now you normalize it for a while, and then you prepare to repeat the cycle to get them more and more into the control mechanism of a government with enhanced powers, forgetting about the human rights of the citizens who no longer believe they have any human rights because they don't have a spiritual idea of their existence or of God. Now, this pattern is what we're experiencing today in the United States. And you can tell it by several ways. You can tell it by the corruption at the heart of our government. Biden, Gates, the entire stealing of money. Our Congress is bought and sold. It's a disgrace that the Bidens are not being prosecuted by the Department of Justice, but the Department of Justice itself is woke and in sympathy with the undertrodden, namely the critical race theory, those who believe this. And critical race theory demonizes the white race. The key idea of this dynamic, this psych-op, is one that has a characteristic to it of a mass illusion, a mass psychosis, and it ends ultimately in the society self-destructing. And that's the goal. That's what the left is after here. And this is cleverly engineered and brilliantly engineered to produce the very result we're seeing today. Now, the major reason I think it doesn't work is because that this will not succeed is because as I started out, it doesn't work. What doesn't work here? Well, I point out that in the climate change movement, they want you to use wind and solar, and it all turns into junk. Societies that go that way end up deindustrializing. We begin to have high inflation. We begin to have uncontrollable economies losing jobs in massive numbers. That will start here in 2024. Economies going into global recession, debts piling up to insurmountably high levels, like the United States with 33, rapidly going to $34 trillion in national debt. In terms of the culture war, it ends up in insanity, because once you've convinced everyone that male-female doesn't exist, the families are arbitrary, that God was invented by society to suppress people from having their uninhibited libido, sex, what you produce is chaos. Got a group of people who are sexually confused, and so they're men who are homosexual, women who are becoming lesbian, and you find fewer people are getting together to marry, fewer people are getting together to have children, and the sexual mutilations and changes that occur with the bodies being altered in the sex transformation surgery is going to disfigure and I think cripple a whole generation of Americans, especially if it becomes rampant. The psychology that goes along with it is that parents can't object, and if they do, the state has the right to take the children from the parents. All of this is insanity, and it leads to a chaotic society, which is what we're facing today. Now, one end and one final point, because this kind of ties it all together for me and things I'm seriously thinking about today. And that is, you deal with Russia, and Russia's looking at this self-destruction going on in the United States, and Russia's saying, these people are satanic. These ideas are not natural law. These ideas are crazy. And Putin is warning that if we want only war, if this is all about a death cult, all we can see is death. We can see killing babies. We can see mutilating children. If this is about death, then we are headed possibly to a world war with Russia. And Russia's trying to prevent it because Russia's saying in Ukraine, which was caused by the State Department, which was caused by NATO, pushing NATO to the edge of Russia, not working with Russia to allow Russia to have access to the Atlantic through Ukraine and the Baltic and the Black Sea, or through the Baltic Sea in the north with Finland, putting Finland and Ukraine into NATO. Finland's in NATO. Ukraine is wanting to be in NATO. Very possibly, since the election's coming up and these demons do not want Donald Trump to get back in, I can envision an October surprise being a nuclear war and a canceling of an election. And I'm worrying that we're coming to a culminating moment in all this when the left is really going to go all in and try to destroy everything that exists. And if they do that, we will have a nuclear war and billions of people will die. And Putin has been warning about this consistently, and I don't think we paid enough attention to his warnings. Now, I'm going to ask Chris to come in because I want to wrap this up in a minute with some quotations from Archbishop Vigano, who has been a critic of Pope Francis, and he's written some very brilliant things articulating the nature of the spiritual warfare we're in. Chris, would you like to comment?
Now, this is it's a fight for the soul of the world. Even at this point, we already know America is in a fight for its soul, but the rest of the free world as well. You saw a lot of the Marxist nations losing this war. Some of them are trying to come back. and you'll be reading from Archbishop Vigano. We have a lot from him on thetruthcentral.com, of course, but he's in almost a one-man fight to even preserve the soul of the Roman Catholic Church at this point.
He's fighting to preserve the soul of the world. I think he sees this tremendous risk and danger that he is warning everyone that it may almost be too late. But again, as long as God's in the battle, it's never too late. There's always a chance for God to win. We haven't lost as long as God is in the battle, and God remains in the battle. Now, he's delivered a couple of very important messages, and I'm going to read a paragraph from one he gave to a group I participated in internationally, listening to various brilliant people talking, and Archbishop Vigano talked to that group. And what he said is that today the government leaders are in this globalism, are committing crimes in a way that they have a name and they have a face. The accomplices in governments and institutions who are guilty of high treason and very serious crimes all come from the World Economic Forum and were students of its program called Young Global Leaders for Tomorrow. Others, like George Soros, support them by means of philanthropic foundations that fuel social strife, civil war, and color revolutions around the world. They say this global coup d'etat must be denounced, and those responsible must be tried and judged by an international court. But above all, Bishop Vigano writes, it is necessary for all of us to understand that this is an all-out war against humanity, and it's not motivated only by the lust for wealth and power, but mainly by a religious motive, a theological reason. This reason is Satan's hatred of God, hatred of God's creation, hatred of man who is created in the image and likeness of God. Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, George Soros, and the hundreds of servants they blackmail in government all hate God. They hate life, which only God can give. They hate love, which only comes from God. They hate peace, which can reign only where Christ reigns. As Tucker Carlson said a few days ago, we are facing people who serve Satan and the demons of hell, just as normal people worship and serve God. Now, what Bishop Vigano is saying is that we must fight this, but we must fight this in ways where the globalism is weak, not where it's strong. He says, this then is a battle in which body and soul, matter and spirit are made the object of a mortal attack by men and spiritual powers. But let us not forget that if our enemy avails himself of the help of infernal spirits, we have on our side the Lord God of the armies arrayed, and all the hosts and angels and saints, infinitely more powerful than Satan. God is almighty. Let us never forget that. And his Father. And he does not abandon his children in times of trial. So fighting this, we must fight where this is weak. Continues Bishop Vigano. I therefore exhort you, dear friends, to fight this battle with the spiritual weapons that God places at your disposal. Prayer, trust in the Lord, and the awareness that this enemy will not be defeated where it is most organized and fearsome, but by striking it where it is weak. This weakness comes from its corruption, where it's being subservient to evil, from the execrable sins that it has committed and still commits against God's little children, both in the womb and pedophilia. Because I tell you, the men and women who in these 4 years have submitted and endured lockdowns, violations of their rights, job deprivation, and social segregation are not willing to tolerate the crimes that this cursed network of perverts and pedophiles commits against children. Therefore, bring to light and courageously denounce the network and complicity and crimes of politicians, bankers, actors, journalists, prelates, and famous people who are united by their blood pact and the whole castle of lies and deceptions that they have hatched will collapse. That's why we call it the truth central here. Dragging with it in the collapse the entire global plan, woke ideology, gender theory, and the fake climate emergency, health fraud, and legal currency, and digital currency. He's saying, when a Latin maxim, that just as they stand together, also they must collapse together. These are very important messages, because what they're saying is, and what Bishop Vigano was saying, is to win the spiritual battle, we must fight a spiritual war. And I always close with reference to 2 Chronicles 7:14, which the Bible encourages us that the solution is to get on our knees and ask God's forgiveness. It's an act of repentance for our sins and how we've gotten the world to sin against God. Taking God out of our schools, killing so many millions of babies in the womb, chopping them to pieces. These are living souls, and we do not have the right to tamper with God's creation. Not in the sense of destruction of life by brutal abortions. I don't believe God created the human race to lose. I think we will win, but I think we're going to go through a massive judgment of God. And I think we'll get through it, but it's going to require us to experience what is normally called final days. Chris, any last thoughts before we wrap up, and then I will move on to final points I want to make.
Well, we can only keep fighting. That's basically it. We have to spread the word. If you're watching this program, spread the word to others. Post them on groups. If you're if you have a social media page and you talk to like-minded people who need to know that there are people like Dr. Corsi here exposing the truth and fighting for what's right, and of course Archbishop Vigano as well. So spread the word. Keep an eye on how things are going, and yes, try to help educate others and keep the fight going, because they're not going to stop. And that's a fact. And they're going to do it blatantly, and they're going to do it subtly.
Yep, they're going to do it in every way they can. But the point is here that they're weak and we are strong. They're confused. What they produce, judged by the fruit of the tree, doesn't work.
Well, look what they pick as their leaders. So
picking people who hate America.
Right.
AOC, Barack Obama, Biden, who's demented in the White House. If these are the leaders you want to follow, then I think we should not let the schizophrenics run the asylum. And the people who are not strong enough in their own sense to develop moral values and to see God's natural law, to accept responsibility for being adult and being moral, will not ruin this world. They've tried before and they failed. And they will fail again. So in the end, God always wins. Please join me in 2 Chronicles 7:14, and know that God will triumph, and this darkness will come to an end as we shine light, the light of truth, on this sick ideology of critical theory, which has pervaded our land and must be sent back to hell where it belongs. As Dr. Jerome Corsi today is Wednesday, it's February 28th, 2024. Thank you for joining us at the truthcentral.com. We'll be back tomorrow.